Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and I recently did a video entitled "The Shuffler Isn't Broken," talking about how it's very commonly misconceived that the shuffler is broken or cheating, when the reality is that it's just not very well understood. Today, we're going to further that discussion and talk about mulligans as a concept, meaning you get to pitch back your hand and draw potentially one less card for a fresh look. Why that is sometimes being misused, how it should properly be used, and how the draw mechanism within the Arena client appears to work. But hey, before we get into all that, I wanted to take just a moment to thank my community for helping the Stronghold reach a bit of a long-term goal here. 1,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel. Definitely a tremendous thing. Thank you for all the views, all the subs, all the likes, all the comments, and just generally being a very supportive community. It means so much more than you'll ever know. And hey, what do you do when you reach a goal? You set a new one. So moving forward, my main talking point goal is going to be to reach just 50 followers over on Twitch. And frankly, we're already about halfway there, so this one should be really easy. If you're not already following me on Twitch, please consider doing so. And that always gives you kind of a sneak peek of some of the live play content, things like that. And of course, the support continues to help the community grow. And I'll be thinking up a giveaway to do once we get there. Probably not a whole account this time around, but hey, that's okay. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. First off, I think mulligans is one of the things that particularly new players can learn that will add the most to their game as well as their win percentage. That having been said, I think people mulligan hands based on the quote-unquote wrong number of lands far more often than they should. I think players need to look at the other cards in their hand and see if that is potentially playable for the first 2-3 turns, and in so give the draw engine time to smooth things out. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there's never a time to mulligan based on the number of lands, and that is primarily what we're going to be talking about today. And to start off the mulligan conversation, let's take a look at the London mulligan that is used in Paper Magic that I think most of us are going to be primarily familiar with.
Now, the first thing you need to know about mulligans is don't talk about mulligans. No, wait, that's something else entirely different. Really, what mulligans is all about is what you are going to have in your opening hand. And for me, what I like to have is enough lands and castable spells to get me through my first 3 turns. I really want to look at that hand and have a plan of what I'm going to do over those first few critical turns. Oftentimes, as a budget player, we find ourselves playing aggro decks. And if we waste or don't optimize those first 2 or 3 turns, you're really going to have problems because your opponent's deck is going to stabilize faster than you can deal out damage. And in the long run, that means you lose.
The reason that I say people tend to mulligan too much about land is the fact that the draw engine is continuing to try and give you the land that you need. In fact, if you were to start with 2 lands in your opening hand with something like a very aggressive 18 mana mono-color red deck wins, you're nearly 30+% likely to draw land on your next draw. Something like the starter decks, this goes up to about 43%, 43.5%, because those decks are starting with a 25 mana land count. And if you were to go with something that is like a greedy multicolor 3+ color deck, running 27 lands, you're starting to approach a 50% likelihood of drawing land on your next draw. And really, 27, 28 lands is something that I see from people way more often than it should be. Those are numbers that you're reserving for something like a very substantial control deck, because this is why people seem to flood out and why they complain about the shuffler being rigged. It's because they have so many lands in their deck that once you combine the way that the draw mechanism actually works, you're way more likely to draw land than you might think you are. If you were to take these three same deck construction, I hate to call them archetypes, but models, let's say models, and model this over, say, 10,000 plus opening hand scenarios, you would get something like the figures that you see on the screen right now. And if you look at that 18 land red deck wins scenario, you can see that you only get a 0 land hand less than 5% out of the time, or 1 in 20 draw or opening hands. For a 1 land hand, it's up to about 20%, but that means you are getting 2 lands or better more than 75% of the time. And when you're talking about a very lean, aggressive deck like Red Deck Wins that maybe only runs 2 or 3 spells that require 3 mana, that means you have all the land you need in your opening hand 75% of the time. And from that point forward, you really only want to draw gas. Land is kind of a dead draw at that point. Floating kind of right there in the middle, you'll see 2.68. That is the expected outcome of a 23 land 60 card deck. And I really feel like that is the sweet spot for most of your best of 1 decks, unless you're getting into some, stretch builds like Red Deck Wins or Mono Blue Control. The reason for that is 2.68 as your expected outcome means you are going to round up to 3 lands, slightly more than you are 2 lands in your opening hand. And, well, that's just a great place to be for a quote-unquote typical deck. When we look at something like a 25 card deck, like those presented in the starter, we get an expected outcome of 2.92, just below 3. And when you go to 27 lands or even higher, you get an expected outcome of 3 plus. And it's deck building like this with 25 and 27 lands in it that have built the expectation with new players that they're supposed to have 3 lands in their opening hand. And that leads to a lot of mulliganing situations where they only got 1 or 2 lands and might be able to draw out of it, but they refuse to try because that expectation of must have 3 lands is in there, so front and center. In fact, if you look closely at the 25 and 27 land columns, and down at the bottom for those undesirable 1 and 0 land hands, you actually see that going from 25 to 27 slightly increases the likelihood of getting those undesirable lands. And it's really not until you get to that 3 land category where things start to meet our expectations, and I'm sure the question that you're asking yourself right now is, how the hell does that happen? And really, it's about managing expectations. I've mentioned on several occasions that things like the shuffler, the draw mechanism, they are trying to give you what you want when it comes to your land density. What we haven't addressed at this point is, how does it know what you want? And again, we come back to expectations. We need only look at the 2024 class of starter decks to see a good example of what the arena expectation is for a typical deck. These tend to have approximately a 40% land density. They're built on a 2-color mana base, and they most often have 3 non-basic named lands in the deck outside of things like mountains and forests. Not to say a quantity of only 3 cards, but 3 names for non-basic lands. When you build a deck that is below these metrics, say a one color, very aggressive mono red deck that only runs mountains, you are sending a signal to the shuffler that land is not particularly important to your deck. On the other end of the spectrum, if you build a greedy 4-color 27 land deck, you have then sent a signal that land is very important to your deck. And while it's difficult to know if each of these has the same weighting, which one might be more important, the severity of the signals, we can definitely tell that the shuffler and the draw mechanism do not meet standardized expectations for a physically shuffled deck. And we can see that in the data because these projections are based on shuffling a physical 60-card deck with the given attribute, but the Arena client doesn't produce those same results. And while we don't have access to the code and can't say for sure exactly how the draw and shuffler mechanisms work, when it comes to the draw mechanism, what appears to be happening is what we refer to as the two-deck method. In this method, anytime that you're getting ready to draw a card from your deck, which has not already been determined with something like Ponder or Brainstorm or something like that, the client appears to be making two copies of your deck, one of which is represented by the last state of your deck. The last time it ran this, it's using that existing copy. It creates a second copy that is then reshuffled, and a card is drawn from each of these decks, and then the draw mechanic, the draw algorithm, decides which of those two is better for you, and then moves that version of the deck to being your only copy of the deck. And of course, all of this happens in a blink of an eye thanks to the computer age. Now, most of the time, there's really not a decision to be made. Given a 40% land density in a typical deck, roughly 16% of the time, those decks are going to both produce an island, and another 36% of the time, they are going to produce a non-land. I should have said land a moment ago, not just island. The other 48% of the time, though, the two decks present a situation where one is a land and the other is a non-land. And at that point, it does have a decision to make. There is also some evidence and data to suggest that the draw mechanism may be doing this with other categories, not just land and non-land, like creature versus non-creature, permanent versus non-permanent. But really, because those tend to be so corner case, it is really exponentially difficult to try and get enough data to really get solid determinations on those. But again, there's some expectation that that might be happening too. So the question then becomes, in those situations where one deck presents a land and the other presents a non-land, how does it make those determinations? And that all comes back to the expectations that we have set earlier through the construction of our deck. If you have set an expectation that land isn't that important, you're far more likely to get the non-land card. On the other side of the coin, if you have set an expectation that land is important to your deck, you're probably going to end up with that land card more often than not. So how does that play out across different deck constructions? If we apply this methodology to something like a very aggressive monocolored red deck wins, we'll see that approximately 44% of the time you're going to draw a gas card, i.e. a not land card. Another 45% of the time your decks are going to split, and you'll have a land and a non-land card. And like we just discussed, in this model, you're far more likely to get the non-land, bringing your total up to 89% potentially. That means as little as 11% of the time you're going to draw lands in something like Red Deck Wins. And that's why this deck has a reputation of being so easily playable and so consistent, because 89% of the time the deck is providing you with answers. So if you have built your deck correctly and leaned into the modeling here that we have talked about, or downloaded such a deck from a great site like etherhub.com, you very easily end up with a deck that not only achieves win rates in the high 60s, but is pretty darn easy to play even for a beginner. I mean, heck, even if you ended up in a corner case scenario of a one land opening hand and you decided to keep that, you would be looking at a situation where 80% of your deck is going to provide favorable draws, because 47% of your deck is one drop spells and another 33% or so is going to be lands. That means 80% of the time you're still doing okay. Alright, so now let's talk about specifically mulliganing a deck like this. What you see on the screen right here is some population extrapolations of a 60 card deck running 20 land sources and drawing 7 cards, 6 cards, and 5 cards. As you can see in the leftmost column of numbers here, 75% of the time or more, you're going to draw an opening hand with 2 or more land cards. And less than 5% of the time, you're going to draw a opening hand with 0 land cards. If we were to mulligan that away and then draw 6 instead, our 2 in the opening hand drops to 66%, a little more than 9% decrease. And if we were to mulligan again, that then drops to about 54.5%, or a little more than an 11% decrease. And if you remember from a couple slides back, we talked about you were likely to draw a land card approximately 11% of the time. So in almost any situation, doing a second mulligan with this deck is virtually suicide. Because now you are actually guaranteeing to have less land rather than more. If we talk about this deck in general terms, from my experience, I find that there's really only 2 situations in which I mulligan with this deck. That is if you are playing best of 3 and you know you need in game 2 or game 3 a particular opening hand against a particular matchup. Other than that, and for pretty much all best of 1 scenarios, I would only mulligan this in that really, really obscure case of having 0 lands in your opening hand. And remember that 0 lands in your initial 7 being less than 5%, that's for a single draw case. And like we talked about in The Shuffler Isn't Broken, you are in fact drawing 2 hands and then getting the one that's better. So that 5% chance of getting a 0 land hand is way overstated at 5%. In fact, from my experience, it happens less than 1% of the time. And I have played decks like this, literally tens of thousands of personal experiences, and I have probably seen less than 10 per year of drawing 0 lands. So the answer is no, you should probably not mulligan your opening hand with this deck, which means it's even easier to play because your mulligan decision is virtually a non-quantity. And just to briefly flip the script here, let's take a look at that greedy multicolor high land count deck. Here you are about 20% likely to draw lands off of each of your theoretical decks. Another 50% of the time you are very likely to be chosen land because of those land important signals that you have put into your deck building. And that basically adds up to as much as 70% of the time this deck is going to draw lands. And that's why decks like this get a reputation for flooding. And so often you see complaints on the internet with screenshots and whatnot, complaining about decks flooding out. It happens all the time, and this is why. Now, hopefully that gives you a framework to maybe more strategically make your own mulligan decisions with your own decks. In my next continuation of this analytical journey, we are going to dive deep into deck building and cover everything from high synergy strategies that give you more effective decks at lower costs, all the way through getting the right land density for the message you're trying to put into a particular deck, as well as things like creature density and spell density, so that you have a better chance of always drawing exactly what you need. And of course, that leads to higher win percentages. Now, to close out the video, I have a few minutes of mulligan decisions from the last iteration of the green-white Be My +1 deck that was popular a few years back and recently has become much more popular in today's arena.
So without further ado, let's take a look at a couple of hands from my recent Be My +1 deck. Apologies, I didn't snap a screen capture when I actually had the mulligan screen open, but as you can see, this is my opening hand. I have played out one land, but from what you can see here, I have a turn 1 play and a turn 2 play. Even if I don't get a third land drop, I get a turn 3 play. So a pretty explosive start, even if it is not game breaking in its continuity. Really all I need here is a couple more lands and I will be directly on fire, which is not a whole lot to ask from a game of Magic. I ended up keeping this land and did in fact win the hand. Ended up staying on curve, drawing enough land to keep on point, and by the time the synergy kicked in, there was very little they could do with 2 mentors in play. Now, this hand ended up being not only explosive, but absolutely ridiculous. The only thing more I could ask for here was a second Plains to guarantee a turn 2 double Charming Stray. I ended up not getting that, but ultimately I ended up, I believe, with an 11/11 Charm Stray lifelink counter monstrosity, and never had a mentor in play. This was an easy win and an easy decision. Up next, we have another easy decision, but for completely different reasons. This hand is absolutely unkeepable. I have no playable cards until at least turn 3, and that even requires me drawing into a forest. And we all know when you keep these hands, they don't work out, you don't get what you need, and you just die slowly. This was an easy throwback, and what I got in its place was significantly better. This with a turn 2 mentor was an easy decision to keep. I knew that the cards that I was likely to draw were going to cash in on that mentor ability, and I had more than enough land to cast the other spells in my hand. Ultimately, this was a very simple keep decision here, and what I ended up throwing back, in fact, might surprise you, it was the forest. I wanted to make sure I kept 2 planes to be able to cast that Acolyte, hopefully on curve. I did end up getting a 4th land here and winning the hand, although it was a little bit more of a struggle because I was facing a deck absolutely made of removal. But all in all, a good observation of what a good mulligan looks like. Now, this last hand is the last one we're going to talk about in today's video, and I have to admit it looks really solid with a clear turn 2 into a potential turn 3 play. Unfortunately, I kept this and ended up not drawing another land until turn 4 because, as Merchant says, sometimes you just get Magic the Gathering, i.e. land screwed, mana screwed. All in all, this was a really solid looking hand, but just couldn't get there. Ended up losing the match basically because I just could not curve out, which an aggro deck really needs to do. So in conclusion on mulligans, in short, don't be scared of them. This is a skill you're going to want to practice and need to practice and develop over the course of your career playing Magic the Gathering, whether it's in paper or strictly on Arena. Being better at mulligans, spotting good hands versus bad hands, and knowing what to throw back will ultimately increase your win percentage and make you a better player, and in Arena, help you grow your collection even faster as a result.
And folks, before you go, allow me to take just a moment to thank my patrons for supporting everything we do here on the channel. If we're doing this much, imagine what we could do with just a little more support. So take just a moment, check out our Patreon page. We distribute things there, not just for those making pledges, but for all levels. And we're talking about things that don't get distributed through any other means on the community. And hey, it always helps when you do all those YouTube things.